All right, good evening and welcome to the LEV project, 50 years in chains. I must have been under a rock because I didn't know they had so many LEV lift every voice. I guess it would be common, but I didn't know it at the time. So it's not lift every voice and sing, it's lift every voice and read. And so I don't really watch TV, so I didn't realize BET had one. But anywho, thank you those for just who has joined us. Welcome this evening. I'm gonna go easy on the voice and the exclamations because the baby's been giving me the hacky all over me with this weather change, and so my voice is a little bit deeper than usual. So please bear with me once again. If we have anybody out there who desires to read, feel free to let me know. But one second as I update the Facebook social media to let the people know that we're on. We're almost we're almost 3/4 of the way through the book. It's definitely getting interested. If you're just tuning in, if you missed yesterday, he got sold to a new master and he went further down south. He's actually now in Georgia. He went through a few hands, some of which died, and now he found himself as well as some others in the hands of, as according to him, a master who he identifies with, but he has a cruel and wicked wife whose temperament and behavior is off the chain. And so that's where he left us off yesterday, as we're looking at his fate that he at this point doesn't think is too good. It was funny yesterday how he was saying that it was tolerable as long as he had his food and no one was beating him. And then shortly thereafter, when he started to think he was going to get comfortable, they gave him kind of the lead position when the master was out of town. So he was feeling himself. He thought he was doing his thing. And then suddenly his fate changed, and that's really just to show you how it's up and down. Life that they were living at that time, there was no certainty. Um, People and things and behavior was very temperamental, and you're just living in a heightened state of fear and concern. There's some research done on living in that heightened state of fear and how it contributes to the trauma that one feels. But that's a definite next topic. I just noted that from last week. Again, please excuse the voice as I'm trying to fight off this cold here. So all praise be to the Most High. Thank you once again for joining us. So we're on chapter 13 of this very eventful book, 50 Years in Chains by Charles Ball. Starting at chapter 14. The low country I now lived in was new and abounded with every sort of game common to a new settlement. Wages were high, and I could sometimes earn $1.50 by doing work on Sunday. The price of a day's work here was $1. My master paid me regularly and fairly for all the work I did for him on Sunday, and I never went away else to procure work. I never went anywhere else, to procure work. All his other hands were treated in the same way. He also gave me an old gun that had seen much hard service, for the stock was quite shattered to pieces, and the lock would not strike fire. I took my gun to a blacksmith in the neighborhood, and he repaired the lock, so that my musket was as sure fire as any piece need be. I found upon trial that though the stock and lock had been worn out, the barrel was none the worse for the service it had undergone. I now, for the first time in my life, became a hunter in the proper sense of the word, and generally managed my affairs in such a way as to get the half of Saturday to myself. This I did by prevailing on my master to set my task for the week on Monday morning. Saturday was appropriated to hunting if I had not obliged to work all day, and I soon became pretty expert in the use of my gun. I made salt licks in the woods to which the deer came at night, and I shot them for a seat of clapboards, and that was placed on the branches of a tree. Raccoons abounded here, and were of large size and fat at all seasons. In the month of April, I saw the ground thickly strewed with nuts. The growth of the last year, I now began to live well, notwithstanding the persecution that my mistress still directed against me, and to feel myself in some measure an independent man. The temper of my mistress grew worse daily, and to add to my troubles, the health of my master began to decline. And toward the latter part of autumn, he told me that that already he felt the symptoms of approaching death. This was a source of much anxiety and trouble to me. I was just speaking about that anxiety. For I saw clearly if I ever fell under the unbridled dominion of my mistress, I should regret the worst period of my servitude in South Carolina. I was afraid as winter came on that my master might grow worse and pass away in the spring, for his disease was the consumption of the lungs. We passed the winter in clearing land after we had secured the crops of cotton and corn, and nothing happened on our plantation to disturb the usual monotony of the life of a slave, except that in the month of January, my master informed me that he intended to go to Savannah for the purpose of purchasing groceries and such other supplies as might be required on the plantation in the following season, and that he intended to take down a load of cotton with our wagon and team, and that I must prepare to be the driver. The intelligence was not disagreeable to me, as the trip to Savannah would, in the first place, release me from a short time for the tyranny of my mistress, and in the second, would give me an opportunity of seeing a great deal of strange country. I derived a third advantage in after times for this journey, but with which did not enter into my estate of this affair at that time. For those who've just joined us, we just started, like I said earlier, please excuse the voice, fighting off this hair cold. Um, we're on just started chapter 14. So you didn't miss that much. Again, he's in Georgia. He got sold. He went through two masters, and now he has a terrible mistress. And now his master just told him that they about to go on a road trip. So here we go. My master had not yet erected a cotton gin on his place, the land not being his own, and we hauled our cotton in the seed, nearly 3 miles to be ginned, for which we had to give 1/4 to the owner of the gin. When the time of my departure came, I loaded my wagon with 10 bales of cotton and set out with the same team of 6 mules that I had driven from South Carolina. Nothing of moment happened to me until the evening of the fourth day, when we were 100 miles from home. My master stopped tonight, for he traveled with me on his horse, at the house of an old friend of his. And I heard my master in conversation with this gentleman, for such he certainly was, give me a very good character, and tell him that I was the most faithful and trusty Negro that he had ever owned. Oh boy. He also said that if he lived to see the expiration of the 7 years for which he had leased me, he intended to buy me. He said much more of me, and I thought I heard him tell his friend something about my mistress, but this was spoken in a low tone, and I could not distinctly understand it. When I was going away in the morning with my team, this gentleman came out to the wagon and ordered one of his own slaves to help me to put the harness on my mules. At parting, he told me to stop at his house on my return and stay all night, and said I should always be welcome to the use of his kitchen if it should ever be my lot to travel that way again. I mention these trifles to show that if there are hard and cruel masters in the South, there are also others of contrary character. The slaveholders are neither more nor less than men, some of whom are good and very many are bad. My master and his gentlemen were certainly of the number of the good, but the contrast between them and some others that I have seen was unhappily for many of the slaves very great. I shall hereafter refer to this gentleman as whose house I now was, and shall never name him without honor, nor think of him without gratitude. As I traveled through the country with my team, my chief employment beyond my duty of a team master was to observe the condition of the slaves of the various plantations by which we passed on our journey, and to compare things in Georgia as I now saw them with similar things in Carolina as I had heretofore seen them. There is as much sameness among the various cotton plantations in Georgia as there is among the various farms in New York or New Jersey. He who has seen one cotton field has seen all the other cotton fields, bating the difference that naturally results from good and bad soils or good and bad culture. But the contrast that prevails in the treatment of the slaves on different plantations is very remarkable. We traveled a road that was not well provided with public houses, and we frequently stopped for the night at the private dwelling of the planters. And I observed that my master was received as a visitor and treated as a friend in the family. Whilst I was always left at the road with my wagon, my master supplied me with money to buy food for myself and my mules. It was my practice when we remained all night at these gentlemen houses to go to the kitchen in the evening after I had fed my mules and eaten my supper and pass some time in conversation with the black people I might chance to find there. One evening we halted before sundown, and I unhitched my mules at the road, about 200 yards from the house of a planter, to which my master went to claim hospitality for himself. So they just leaving him outside. After I had disposed of my team for the night and taken my supper, I went as usual to see the people of color in the kitchen belonging to this plantation. The sun had just set when I reached the kitchen, and soon afterwards, a black boy came in and told the woman, who was the only person in the kitchen when I came to it, that she must go down to the overseer's house. She immediately started in obedience to this order, and not choosing to remain alone in a strange house, I concluded to follow the woman and see the other people of this estate. When we were reached the house of the overseer, the colored people were coming in from the field, and with them came the overseer, and another man better dressed than overseers usually are. I stood at some distance from these gentlemen, not thinking it prudent to be too forward among strangers. The black people were all called together, and the overseer told them that some one of them had stolen a fat hog from the pen, carried it to the woods, and there killed and dressed it. That he had the day found the place where the hog had been slaughtered, and that if they did not confess and tell who the perpetrators of this death were, they would be whipped in the severest manner. To this threat, no other reply was made than a universal assertion of the innocence of the accused. They were all then ordered to lie down upon the ground and expose their backs, to which the overseer applied the thong of his long whip by turns until he was weary. It was fortunate for these people that there were more than 20 in number, which prevented the overseer from inflicting many lashes on any one of them. When the whole number had received each in turn a share of the lash, the overseer returned to the man to whom he had first applied the whip and told him he was certain that he knew who stole the hog, and that if he did not tell who the thief was, he would whip him all night. He then again applied the whip in the back of this man until the blood flowed copiously, but the sufferer hid his face in his hands and said not a word. The other gentleman then asked the overseer if he was confident this man had stolen the pig, and receiving an affirmative answer, he said he would make the fellow confess the truth if he would follow his directions. He then asked the overseer if he had ever tried cat hauling upon an obstinate Negro, and he was told that this punishment had been heard of, but never practiced on this plantation. A boy was then ordered to get up, run to the house, and bring a cat, which was soon produced. The cat, which was a large gray tomcat, was then taken by the well-dressed gentleman and placed upon the bare back of the prostrate black man near the shoulder, and forcibly dragged by the tail down the back and along the bare thighs of the sufferer. The cat sunk his nails into the flesh and tore off pieces of the skin with his teeth. The man roared with the pain of his punishment and would have rolled along the ground had it not been held in place for the force of four other slaves, each of whom confined a hand or a foot. As soon as the cat was done drawn from him, the man said he would tell who stole the hog and confessed that he and several others, three of whom were hiding, sorry, three of whom were then holding him, had stolen the hog. Wow. I'm sorry. This is wild. Killed, dressed, and eaten it. In return for this confession, the overseer said he should have another touch of the cat, which was again drawn along his back, not as before from the head downwards, but from below the hip to the head. The man was then permitted to rise, and each of those who had been named by him as a particular participator in stealing the hog was compelled to lie down and have the cat twice drawn along his back, first downwards and then upwards. After the termination of this punishment, you mean cruelty. Right? Each of the sufferers was washed with salt water by a black woman, and they were then all dismissed. This was the most excruciating punishment that I ever saw inflicted on black people. And in my opinion, it was very dangerous. For the claws of the cat are poisonous, and the wounds made by them are very subject to inflammation. During all this time, I had remained at the distance of 50 yards from the place of punishment, fearing either to advance or to retreat, lest I too might incite the indignation of the sanguinary of judges. After the business was over and my feelings became a little more composed, I thought the voice of the gentleman in good clothes was familiar to me, but I could not recollect who he was, nor where I heard his voice, until the gentleman at left his place and went towards the great house. And as they passed me, I recognized in the companion of the overseer my old master, the Negro trader who had bought me in Maryland and brought me to Carolina. Wow. Okay. I afterward learned from my master that this man had formerly been engaged in the African slave trade, which had been given up some years before for the safer and lesser arduous business of buying Negroes in the North and bringing them to South as articles of merchandise, in which he had acquired a very respectable fortune. How is it respectable? But anyway, had lately married in a wealthy family in this part of the country and was a great planter. 2 days after this, we reached Savannah, where my master sold his cotton and purchased a wagon load of sugar, molasses, coffee, shoes, dry goods, and such articles as we stood in need of at home. And on the next day after I entered the city, I again left it and directed my course up the country. In Savannah, I saw many black men who were slaves and who yet acted as free men, so far that they went out to work, where and with whom they pleased, received their own wages, and provided their own subsistence, but were obliged to pay a certain sum at the end of each week to their masters. One of these men told me that he paid $6 on every Saturday evening to his master, and yet he was comfortably dressed and appeared to live well. Savannah was a very busy place, and I saw vast quantities of cotton piled up on the wharves, but the appearance of the town itself was not much in favor of the people who lived in it. On my way home, I traveled for several days by a road different from that which we had pursued in coming down. And at the distance of 50 or 60 miles from Savannah, I passed by the largest plantation that I had ever seen. I think I saw at least 1,000 acres of cotton in one field, which was all as level as Bowling Green. There were, as I was told, 350 hands at work in this field, picking the last of the cotton for the burrs. And there were the most miserable looking slaves that I had seen in all my travels. It was now the depth of winter. And although the weather was not cold, yet it was winter of this climate. And a man who lives on the Savannah River a few years will find himself almost as much oppressed with cold in winter there as if he had been the same person, sorry, as if he would be in the same season of the year on the banks of the Potomac, if he had always resided there. The people were, as far as I could see, totally without shoes, and there was no such garment as a hat of any kind amongst them. Each person had a coarse blanket which had holes cut for the arms to pass through, and the top was drawn up round the neck so as to form a sort of loose frock tied before with strings. The arms, when the people were at work, were naked, and some of them had a very little clothing of any kind beside this blanket frock. The appearance of these people afforded the most conclusive evidence that they were not eaters of pork, and that Lent lasts with them throughout the year. I'm not going to comment on his pork again today. I again stayed all night as I went home with the gentleman whom I have before mentioned as the friend of my master, sorry, who had left me soon after we quitted Savannah, and I saw him no more until I reached home. Soon after my return from Savannah, an affair of a very melancholy character took place in the neighborhood of my master's plantation. About 2 miles from our residence lived a gentleman who was a bachelor and who had for his housekeeper a mulatto woman. The master was a young man, not more than 25 years old, and the housekeeper must have been at least 40. She had children grown up, one of whom had been sold by her master, the father of the bachelor, since I lived here and carried away to the West. This woman had acquired a most uncountable influence over her young master, who lived with her as his wife, and gave her the entire command of his house and of everything about it. Before he came to live here, he now did. And whilst he still resided with his father, to whom the woman then belonged, the old gentleman, perceiving the attachment of his son to this female, had sold her to a trader who was on his way to Mississippi River in the absence of the young man. But the latter returned home and learned what had been done. He immediately set off in pursuit of the purchaser, overtook him somewhere in the Indian territory, and brought the woman of him at an advanced price. He then brought her back and put her as his housekeeper on the place where he now lived, left his father, and came to reside in person with the woman. Wow, okay. On a plantation adjoining that of the gentleman bachelor lived a planter who owned a young mulatto man named Frank, not more than 24 or 5 years old, a very smart as well as handsome fellow. Frank had become a much enamored of this woman, who was old enough to have been his mother, as her master, the bachelor, was, and she returned Frank's attachment to the prejudice of her owner. Frank was in the practice of visiting his mistress at night, a circumstance of which her master was suspicious, and he forbade Frank from coming to the house. This only heightened the flame that was burning in the bosom of the lovers, and they resolved, after many and long deliberations, to destroy the master. She projected the plot and furnished the means for the murder by taking her master's gun from the place where he usually kept it and giving it to Frank, oh boy, who came to the house in the evening when the gentleman was taking his supper alone. Lucy always waited upon her master at his meals, and knowing his usual place of sitting, had made a hole between two of the logs of the house, towards which she knew his back would be at supper. At a given signal, Frank came quietly up to the house, leveled the gun through the hole prepared for him, and discharged a load of buckshot between the shoulders of the unsuspecting master, who sprang from his seat and fell dead beside the table. This murder was not known in the neighborhood until the next morning, when the woman herself went to a house on an adjoining plantation and told it. The murdered gentleman had several other slaves, none of whom were at home at the time of his death except for one man, and he was so terrified that he was afraid to run and alarm the neighbor. I knew this man well and believed that he was afraid of the woman and her accomplice. I never had a doubt of his innocence, though he suffered a punishment upon no other evidence than mere suspicion, far more terrible than any other ordinary form of death. For those who just joined us, we are reading chapter 14. This is 14? Yeah, chapter 14 of 50 Years Enslaved, if we in chains. If we have anyone who would like to share in this reading, feel free to let me know. and we can do that. Let me just make sure we don't have any questions or comments here. All right, we're good. Let me go back over here. This is getting interesting. Oh, it already is. Okay, where am I here? As soon as the murderer was known to the neighbor, sorry, not the murderer. As soon as the murder was known to the neighboring gentlemen, they hastened to visit the dead body and were no less expeditious in insinuating, instituting inquiries after those who had done the bloody deed. My master was amongst the first who arrived at the house of the deceased, and in a short time, half the slaves of the neighboring plantation were arrested and brought to the late dwelling of the dead man. For my own part, from the moment I heard of the murder, I had no doubt of its author. Silence is a great virtue when it is dangerous to speak, and I had long since determined never to advance opinions uncalled for in controversies between the white people and the slaves. Many witnesses were examined by a justice of the peace before the coroner arrived, but after the coming of the latter, a jury was called, and more than half a day was spent in asking questions of various black people without the disclosure of any circumstance which tended to fix the guilt of the murder upon anyone. My master, who was present all this time, at last desired them to examine me, if it was the thought that my testimony could be of any service in the matter, as he wished me to go home to attend to my work. I was sworn on the testament to tell the whole truth, and started at the commencement of my testimony that I believed Frank and Lucy, to be the murderers, and proceeded to assign the reasons upon which my opinion was founded. Frank had not been present at this examination, and Lucy, who had been sworn, had said she knew nothing of this matter, that at the time her master was shot, she had gone into the kitchen for some milk for his supper, and that on hearing the gun, she had come into the room at the moment he fell to the floor and expired. But when she opened the door and looked out, she could neither hear nor see anyone. When Frank was brought in and made to touch the dead body, which he was compelled to do because some said that if he was the murderer, the corpse would bleed at his touch, he trembled so much that I thought he would fall, but no blood issued from the womb of the dead man. This compulsory touch of the dead had, however, in this instance, a much more powerful effect in the conviction of the criminal than the flowing of any quantity of blood could have done. For as soon as Frank had withdrawn his hand from the touch of the dead, the coroner asked him in a peremptory tone, as if conscious of the fact, why he had done this. Frank was so confounded with fear and overwhelmed by this interrogation, basically, that he lost all self-possession and cried out in a voice of despair that Lucy had made him do it. Mhm. Lucy, who had left the room when Frank was brought in, was now recalled and confronted with her part in guilt, but nothing would wring a word of confession from her. She persisted that if Frank had murdered her master, he had done it on his own accord and without her knowledge of advice. Someone now, for the first time, thought of making search for the gun of the dead man, which was not found in the place where he usually had kept it. Frank said he had committed the crime with this gun, which he had placed in his hands by Lucy. Frank, Lucy, and Billy, a black man against whom there was no evidence nor cause of suspicion, except that he was in the kitchen at the time of the murder, were committed to prison in a new log house on an adjoining plantation, closely confined in irons and kept there a little more than 2 weeks, when they were all tried before some gentlemen of the neighborhood, who held a court for that purpose. They just had all these kangaroo courts going on. Lucy and Frank were condemned to be hung, but Billy was found not guilty, although he was not released, but kept in confinement until the execution of his companions, which took place 10 days after the trial. On the morning of the execution, my master told me and all the rest of the people that we must go to the hanging, as it was termed by him as well as others. The place of punishment was only 2 miles from my master's residence, and I was there in time to get a good stand. Is he bugging out right now? He acting like he at the box office. near the gallows tree, by which I was enabled to see all the proceedings connecting with this solemn affair. It was estimated by my master that there were at least 15,000 people present at this scene, more than half of whom were black. All the masters for a great distance round the country had permitted or compelled their people to come to this hanging. Billy was brought to the gallows with Lucy and Frank, but was permitted to walk beside the cart in which they rode. Under the gallows, after the rope was around her neck, Lucy confessed that the murder had been designed by her in the first place, and that Frank had only perpetrated it at her instance. She said she had at first intended to apply to Billy to assist her in undertaking, but afterwards communicated her designs to Frank, who offered to shoot her master if she would supply him with a gun and let no other person be in on the secret. A long sermon was preached by a white man under the gallows, which was only the limb of a tree, and afterwards an exhortation was delivered by a black man. The two convicts were hung together, and after they were quite dead, a consultation was held among the gentlemen as to the future deposition of Billy, who had been in the house when his master was murdered, and had not having not sorry, and not having given immediate information of the fact, was held to be guilty of concealing the death, and was accordingly sentenced to receive 500 backside, 500 lashes. I was in the branches of a tree close by the place where the court was held, and distinctly heard its proceedings and judgment. Some went to the woods to cut hickories, while others stripped Billy and tied him to a tree. More than 20 long switches, some of them 6 or 7 feet in length, had been procured, and two men applied the rod at the same time, one standing on each side of the culprit, one of these using his left hand. I had often seen black men whipped, and had always, when the lash was applied with great severity, heard the sufferer cry out and beg for mercy. But in this case, the pain inflicted by the double blows of the hickory was so intense that Billy never uttered so much as a groan, and I do not believe he breathed for the space of 2 minutes after he received the first strokes. He shrank his body close to the trunk of the tree around which his arms and legs were lashed, drew his shoulders up to his head like a dying man, and trembled, or rather shivered, in all his members. The blood flowed from the commencement and in a few minutes lay in small pools at the root of the tree. I saw flakes of flesh as long as my finger fall out of the gashes in his back, and I believe he was insensible during all the time that he was receiving the last 200 lashes. When the whole 500 lashes had been counted by the person appointed to perform this duty, the half-dead body was unbound and laid in the shade of the tree upon which I sat. The gentlemen who had done the whipping, 8 or 10 in number, being joined by their friends, then came under the tree and drank punch until their dinner was made ready, under a booth of green boughs at a short distance. After dinner, Billy, who had been groaning on the ground where he laid, was taken up, placed in a cart which Lucy and Frank had been brought to the gallows, and conveyed to the dwelling of his late master, where he was confined to the house and bed more than 3 months, and was never worth much afterwards while I remained in Georgia. Lucy and Frank, after they had been half an hour upon the gallows, were cut down and suffered to drop into a deep hole that had been dug under them whilst they were suspended. As they fell, so the earth was thrown upon them, and the grave closed over them forever. They were hung on Thursday, and the vast assemblage of people had convened to witness their death did not leave the place altogether until next Monday morning. Wagons, carts, carriages had been brought upon the ground, booths and tents erected for the convenience and accommodation of the multitude. And the terrible spectacles that I have just described were succeeded by music, dancing, trading in horses, gambling, drinking, fighting, and every other species of amusement and excess to which the Southern people are addicted. I had to work in the daytime, but every night to witness this funeral carnival, the number that joined in which appeared in increase rather than diminish during the Friday and Saturday that followed the execution. It was not until Sunday afternoon that the crowd began sensibly to diminish, and on Monday morning after breakfast, the last wagons left the ground, now trampled into dust as dry as light as ashes, and the grave of the murderers were left to the solitude of the woods. Certainly those who were hung well deserved their punishment, but it was a very arbitrary exercise of power to whip a man until he was insensible because he did not prevent a murder which was committed without his knowledge. And I could not understand the right of punishing him because he was so weak or timorous as to refrain from the disclosure of the crime the moment it came to his knowledge. It is necessary for the Southern people to be vigilant in guarding the, I'm going to say, quote, he just got moral. I'm going to have to put a quote up in here. The quote, moral condition of their slaves, even to punish the intention to commit crimes when that intention can be clearly proved. For such is the natural relation of master and slave, if by far the greater number of cases that no cordiality of feeling can ever exist between them, and the sentiments that bind together the different members of society in a state of freedom and social equality being absent, the master must resort to principles of physical restraint and rules of mental coercion unknown in another and different condition of the social compact. I got to outline that part right there. Sorry about that. It is It is a mistake to suppose that the Southern planters could ever retain their property or live amongst their slaves if those slaves were not kept in terror of the punishment that would follow acts of violence and disorder. There is no difference between the feeling of the different races of men so far as their personal rights are concerned. The black man is as anxious to possess and to enjoy liberty as the white one would be. Were he deprived of his inestimable blessings, it is now for me to say that the one is as well qualified for the enjoyment of liberty as the other. Though ignorance, moral degradation of character, and mental depravity are inseparable companions, and in the the breast of an ignorant man, the passions of envy and revenge hold unbridled dominion. It was in the month of April that I witnessed the painful spectacle of two fellow creatures being launched into the abyss of eternity, and a third being tortured beyond the sufferings of mere death, not for his crimes, but as terror to others, and this not to deter others from the commission of crimes, but to stimulate them to a more active and devoted performance of their duties to their owners. My spirits had not recovered from the depression produced by that scene, in which my feelings had been awakened in the cause of others, when I was called to a nearer and more immediate apprehension of sufferings, which I now too clearly saw were in preparation for myself. Now he's starting to think about his own fate. Okay, we're still in chapter 14. This is a bit long chapter, but this is a deep chapter right here. So for those who have just joined us, this is the LEV project. We are in chapter 14, about more than halfway through. It says here, my master's health became worse continually, and I expected he would not survive this summer. In this, however, I was disappointed, but he was so ill that he was seldom able to come to the field and paid but little attention to his plantation or the culture of his crops. He left the care of the cotton field to me after the month of June and was not again out on the plantation before the following October, when he one day came out on a little Indian pony that he had used as a hackney, before he was so far reduced as to decline the practice of riding. I suffered very much this summer for the want of good and substantial provisions, my master being no longer able to supply me with his liberality from his own meat house. I was obliged to lay out nearly all my other earnings in the course of the summer for bacon, him and his bacon, man, to enable me to bear the hardship and toil to which I was exposed. My master often sent for me to come to the house and talk to me in a very kind manner, and I believe that no hired overseer could have carried on the business more industriously than I did until the crop was secured the next winter. Soon after my master was in the field in October, he sent for me to come to him one day and gave me, on parting, a pretty good great coat, a pretty good great coat of strong drab cloth, almost new, which he said would be the service to me in the coming winter. He also gave me at the same time a pair of boots which he had worn half out, but the legs of which were quite good. This great coat and these boots were afterwards of great service to me. As the winter came on, my master grew worse, and though he still continued to walk about in the house in good weather, it was manifest he was approaching the close of his earthly existence. I worked very hard this winter. The crop of cotton was heavy, and we did not get it all out of the field until sometime after Christmas, which compelled me to work hard myself and to cause my fellow slaves to work hard too, in clearing the land that my master was bound to clear every year on this place. He desired me to get as much of the land cleared in the time for cotton as I could and to plant the rest of the corn when cleared off. As I was now entrusted with the entire superintendence of the plantation by my master, who never left his house, it became necessary for me to assume the authority of an overseer, here we go, of my fellow slaves, and I not unfrequently found it proper to punish them with stripes. Boy. Sorry. Now he's the overseer now. So I not frequently found it proper to punish them with stripes, to compel them to perform their work. At first, I felt much repugnance against the use of the hickory, the only instrument which I punished offenders. But the longer I was accustomed to this practice, the more familiar and less offensive it became to me. And I believe that a few years of perseverance and experience would have made me inveterate, no, would have made me as inveterate a Negro driver as any in Georgia, though I feel conscious that I never should have become so hardened as to strip a person for the purpose of whipping, nor should I ever have consented to compel people to work without sufficiency of good food, if I had in my power to supply them with enough of this first of comfort. In the month of February, my master became so weak and his cough was so distressing that he took to his bed, from which he never again departed, saving only once before the time when he was removed to be wrapped in his winding sheet. In the month of March, two of the brothers of my mistress came to see her and remained with her until the death of my master. When they had been with their sister about 3 weeks, they came to the kitchen one day, and when I had come in for my dinner and told me that they were going to whip me, I asked them what they were going to whip me for, to which they replied that they thought a good whipping would be good for me, and that at any rate, I must prepare to take it. My mistress was now joined My mistress now joined us, and afterwards swearing at me in the most furious manner for a space of several minutes, and bestowing upon me a multitude of the coarsest epithets, told me that she had long owed me a whipping, and that I should now get it. She then ordered me to take off my shirt, the only garment I had on except a pair of old tow linen trousers, and the two brothers backed the command of their sister, the one presenting a pistol at my breast, and the other by drawing a large club over his head in the attitude of striking me. Resistance was vain, and I was forced to yield. My shirt being off, I was tied by the hands with a stout bed cord and being led to a tree called the Pride of China that grew in the yard. My hands were drawn by rope being passed over limb until my feet no longer touched the ground. Being thus suspended in the air by the rope and my whole weight hanging on my wrists, I was unable to move any part of my person except my feet and legs. I had never been whipped since I was a boy and felt the injustice of the present proceeding with the utmost keenness. But neither justice nor my feelings had an influence upon the hearts of my mistress and her brothers, two men as cruel in temper and savage in manner as herself. The first strokes of the hickory produced a sensation that I can only liken to streams of scalding water running along my back. But after 100 or 150 lashes had been showered upon me, the pain became less acute and piercing, but was succeeded by a dead and painful aching which seemed to extend to my very backbone. As I hung by the rope, the moving of my legs sometimes caused me to turn round, and soon after they began to beat me, I saw the pale and death-like figure of my master standing at the door, where my face was turned toward the house, and heard him in a faint, scarcely louder than a strong breathing, commanding his brother-in-law to let me go. These commands were disregarded until I received full 300 lashes, and doubtlessly more would have been inflicted upon me had not my master, with an effort beyond his strength, by the aid of a stick of which he supported himself, made his way to me and placed his skeleton form beside me as I hung, told his brother-in-law that if he struck another stroke, he would send for a lawyer and have him both persecuted at law. The interposition stopped the process of my punishment, and after cutting me down, they carried my master again into the house. I was yet able to walk and went into the kitchen, whither my mistress followed and compelled me to submit to be washed in brine by a black woman who acted as her cook. I was then permitted to put my shirt on and go to my bed. This was Saturday, and on the next day when I awoke late in the morning, I found myself unable to turn over or to rise. I felt too indignant at the barbarity with which I had been treated to call for help for anyone, and lay in my bed made of corn husks until after 12 o'clock, when my mistress came to me and asked me how I was. A slave was not to manifest feelings of resentment. Very interesting. Sorry. A slave was not to manifest feelings of resentment, and I answered with humility that I was very sore and unable to get up. She then called a man and a woman who came and raised me up, but I now found that my shirt was as fast to my back as if it had grown there. The blood and bruised flesh having become incorporated with the substance of the linen, it formed only the outer coat of the great scab that covered my back. After I was downstairs, my mistress had me washed in warm water, and warm grease was rubbed over my back and sides until the shirt was saturated with oil, and becoming soft was at length separated from my back. My mistress then had me washed and greased and put upon me one of my master's old linen shirts. She had become alarmed and was fearful either that I should die or would not be able to work again for a long time, and in the end she lost myself in consequence of this whipping. As soon as I was able to walk, my master sent for me to come to his bedside, and told me he was very sorry for what had happened, that it was not his fault, and that if he had been well, I should never have been touched. Tears came in his eyes as he talked to me, and said that as he could not live long, he hoped I would continue faithful to him whilst he did live. This I promised to do, for I really loved my master, but I had already determined that as soon as he was in the grave, I would attempt to escape from Georgia and the cotton country. In my life, if my life should be the forfeit of the attempt. As soon as I recovered of my wounds, I again went to work, not in my former situation of superintendent of the master's plantation, for this place was now occupied by one of the brothers of my mistress, but in the woods where my mistress had determined to clear a new field. After this, I did nothing but grab and clear land while I remained in Georgia, but I was always making preparations for my departure from that country. Last paragraph, and please stick with us. This is the last paragraph, but I'll say it when I'm done. My master was an officer of the militia and had a sword which he wore on a parade days, and at other times he hung it up in the room where he slept. I conceived an idea that this sword would be of service to me in the long journey that I intended to undertake. One evening, when I had gone in to see my master and had remained standing at his bedside some time, he closed his eyes as if going to sleep. and it be twilight, I slipped the sword from the place where it hung and dropped it out the window. I knew my master could never need his weapon again, but yet I felt some compunction of conscience at the thought of robbing so a good man. When I left the room, I took up the sword and afterwards secreted it to a hollow tree in the woods near the place at which I worked daily. Now that's the end of reading of chapter 4. We're going to read chapter 15, 14. 15 is not as long because we're going to double up today. So I'm going to take a little intermission, as you could probably hear my voice right now. So I'm going to take a little intermission. I'm going to play a song. Please stick with us. If you have anything to say, just hit me up on social media. Just stick with us while I come right back in 3 to 5 minutes. I'm just going to play a little song here. And that was a heavy chapter. That was a real heavy chapter. Oh, 1 second. We'll talk about it in a minute. I just need to get a little bit of water. All right, let's just play this song here. YouTube doesn't like when you play songs without copyright, so I'll be right back. Okay, now YouTube is acting crazy. Mm-hmm. 1 second. Okay, that's not working. Let's try another song, shall we? What's so funny, baby? Mm-hmm. Hold on, everybody. I'm sorry about that. They didn't want to play that song. We're going to have to get another song. The baby's over here. She's over here laughing. Praise be to the Most High. That was some real serious times at that time. It was some real... Yes, baby. Mm-hmm. That's funny, you laughing? Yeah.
You think you don't need all that. I need to hear scriptures and have them meaningful.
All right. I'll be right back. Sister against sister, brother against brother, life without future. Raise up in the morning, looking at them remote white like flower. Belly grow them things to yourself, boy, me a go there from hunger, what a life. What a life I Raise up in the morning, looking at them remote white like flower. Belly grow them things to yourself, boy, me a go there from hunger. Change your mind and change your life. Change your mind and change your life. One life to live. One life to Everybody must work. Everybody must work. One life to live. One life to live. Every
Looking at a girl move like it's over. Really going into yourself, boy, me a cut it from hunger. What a life I live, one life to live, one life to live. Change your mind, change your life.
All right, everybody work, but not like that. One life. They were working definitely. So for those who joined us, or for those who have stuck over to the little brief intermission, um, we're back chapter 14, and it's like the writer did it kind of when some chapters is not, it's not brutality. Some chapters is just expressing what happened, and then there's some chapters that just leave you like, wow, what in the world? And that was one of those chapters. We had one of those chapters the day before as well. It just shows you where they didn't have really a justice system. Their justice system was some old, uh, you know, I say it, so that's what it is. And before, even if you weren't guilty, in this case they were, but even when you weren't guilty, just on suspicion alone, 500 lashes, just because I feel like it, 300 lashes, it's kind of wild. But whew, as Ima just commented to say that it's deep, and it definitely is. We're gonna go into chapter 14, I mean 15, as my voice holds up here, and then we'll only have five chapters to go to the end of the reading of this book, and then we'll start on another one, just so that we can just give voice. Our foreparents, they wrote these books, or their narratives, in a time where it's not like today. To write your story at that time was a big deal, and I think that is fitting to give voice so that we can gain some more understanding from the experiences of those who came before us. So, once again, thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and jump into chapter 15. As the babies stay quiet, I don't know how much longer they're going to stay quiet for me. My master died in the month of May, and I followed him to his grave with a heavy heart, for I felt that I had lost the only friend I had in the world, who possessed at once the power and the inclination to protect me against the tyranny and oppression to which slaves on a cotton plantation are subject. Had he lived, I should have remained with him and never have left him, for he had promised to purchase the residue of my time, of my illness in Carolina. But when he was gone, I felt the parting of the last tie that bound me to the place where I then was, and my heart yearned for my. Ah, sorry, this is the first time I'm hearing him talking about. For those who've been with us from the beginning, he hasn't talked about his family for a minute. He says now, and my heart yearned for my wife and children, for whom I have been now separated for more than 4 years. I held my life in small estimation if it was to be worn out under the dominion of my mistress and her brothers, though since the death of my master she had greatly ameliorated my condition by giving me frequent allowances of meat and other necessaries. I believe she entertained some vague apprehensions that I might run away and betake myself to the woods for a living, but I do not think she ever suspected that I would hazard the untiring undertaking of attempting to make my way back to Maryland. My purpose was fixed, and now nothing could shake it. I only waited for a proper season of the year to commence my toilsome and dangerous journey. As I must of necessity procure my own substance on my march, it behooved me to pay regard to the time at which I took it up. I furnished myself with a firebox, as it is called, that is, a tin case containing flints, steel, and tinder. This I considered indispensable. I took the great coat that my master had given me, and with a coarse needle and thread quilted a scabbard of old cloth in one side of it, in which I could put my sword and carry it with safety. I also procured a small bag of linen that held more than a peck. This bag I filled with meal and parched corn, grinding the corn after it was parched in the woods where I worked at the mill at night. These operations, except the grinding of the corn, I carried on in a small concealed cabin that I had built in the woods. The boots that my master gave me I had repaired by a Spaniard who lived in the neighborhood and followed the business of a cobbler. Before the 1st of August, I had all my preparations completed and had matured them with so much secrecy that no one in the country, white or black, suspected me of entertaining any extraordinary design. I only waited for the corn to ripe and fit to be roasted, which time I had fixed as a period of my departure. I watched though the progress of the corn daily, and on the 8th of August I perceived in examining my mistress' field that nearly half of the ears were so far grown that by roasting them a man could easily subsist himself. And as I knew that this corn had been planted later than the most of the corn in the country, I resolved to take leave of the plantation and its tenants forever on the next day. I had a faithful dog named Truman, and this poor animal had been my constant companion for more than 4 years. How come this is the first time we hear about Truman? I'm sorry. Without ever showing cowardice or infidelity but once, and that was when the panther followed us from the woods. I was accordingly anxious to bring my dog with me, but as I knew the success of my undertaking depended on secrecy and silence, I thought it safest to abandon my last friend and engage in my perilous enterprise alone. On the morning of the 9th, I went to work as usual, carrying my dinner with me, and worked diligently at grubbing until 1 o'clock in the day. I now sat down and took my last dinner as the slave of my mistress, dividing the contents of my basket with my dog. After I had finished, I tied my dog with a rope to a small tree. I set my gun against it, for I thought it should be better without the gun than with it. Tied my knapsack with my bag of meal on my shoulders, and then turned to take a last farewell of my poor dog that stood by the tree to which he was bound, looking wistfully at the last farewell, no, looking wistfully at me. When I approached him, he licked my hand, and then rising on his hind feet and placing his forepaws on my breast, he uttered a long howl, which thrilled through my heart as if he had said, "My master, do not leave me behind." I now took to the forest, keeping as nearly as I could a north course of all the afternoon. Night overtook me before I reached any watercourse or any other object worthy of being noticed, and I lay down and slept soundly without kindling a fire or eating anything. I was awake before day, and as soon as there was light enough to enable me to see my way, I resumed my journey and walked on until about 8 o'clock, when I came to a river, which I knew most by most, which I knew must be the Appalachie. I sat down on the bank of the river, opened my bag of meal, and made my breakfast of parts of its contents. I used my meal very sparingly, it being the most valuable treasure that I now possessed. Though I had in my pocket $3 Spanish, but in my situation this money would not avail me anything, as it was as I resolved not to show myself to any person, whether white or black. After taking my breakfast, I prepared to cross the river, which was about 100 yards wide, with a sluggish and deep current. The morning was sultry, and the thickets along the margin of the river teemed with insects and reptiles. By sounding the river with a pole, I found the stream too deep to be and I waded, and I therefore prepared to swim it. For this purpose, I stripped myself and bound my clothes on the top of my knapsack and my bag of meal on the top of my clothes. Then, drawing my knapsack close up to my head, I threw myself into the river. In my youth, I learned to swim in the Patuxent and have seldom met with any person who was more at ease in deep water than myself. I kept a straight line from the place of my entrance in the Appalachie to the opposite side, and when I had reached it, stepped on the margin of the land and turned round to view the place from which I had set out on my aquatic passage. But my eye was arrested by an object nearer to me than the opposite shore. Within 20 feet of me, in the very line that I had pursued in crossing the river, a large alligator was moving in full pursuit of me, with his nose just above the surface, in the position that creature takes when he gives chase to his intended prey in the water. The alligator can swim more than twice as fast as man, for he can overtake young ducks on the water. And I had been 10 seconds longer, sorry, and had I been 10 seconds longer in the river, I should have been dragged to the bottom and never again heard of. Seeing that I had gained the shore, my pursuer turned, made 2 or 3 circles in the water close by me, and then disappeared. I received this admonition as a warning of the dangers that I must encounter in my journey to the north. After adjusting my clothes, I again took to the woods and bore a little to the east of north. It now being my determination to turn down the country so as to gain the line of roads by which I had come to the south. I traveled all day in the woods, but a short time before sundown came within view of an opening in the forest, which I took to be cleared fields. But upon closer examination, finding no fences or enclosed around it, I advanced into it and found it to be an open savanna, with a small stream of water creeping slowly through it. At the lower side of the open space were the remains of an old beaver dam, the central part of which had been broken away by the current of stream at the time of some flood. Around the bargain of this former pond, I observed several decayed beaver lodges and numerous stumps of small trees that had been cut down for the food or fortification of these industrious little nation, which had fled at the approach of the white man, and all its people were now, like me, seeking refuge in the deep solitudes of the forest from the glance of every human eye. As it was growing late and I believed I must now be near the settlements, I determined to encamp for the night beside this old beaver dam. I again took my supper from my bag of meal and made my bed for the night amongst the canes that grew in the place. This night I slept but little, for it seems as if the owls in the country had assembled in my neighborhood to perform a grand musical concert. Their hooting and chattering commenced soon after dark and continued until the dawn of day. In all parts of the southern country, the owls are very numerous, especially along the margins of streams, and in the low countries with which the waters are universally bordered. But since I had been in the country, although I had passed many nights in the woods at all seasons of the year, I had never before heard so clamorous and deafening a chorus of nocturnal music. With the coming of the morning, I arose from my couch and proceeded warily along the woods, keeping a continual lookout for plantations and listening attentively to every noise that I heard in the trees or amongst the cane breakers. When the sun had been up 2 or 3 hours, I saw an appearance of a blue sky at a distance through the trees, which proved that the forest had been removed from a spot somewhere before me, and at no great distance from me, and I cautiously advanced. I heard the voices of people in loud conversation, sitting down amongst the palmetto plants that grew around me in great numbers. I soon perceived that the people whose conversation I heard were coming nearer to me. I now heard the sound of horses' feet immediately afterwards, saw 2 men on horseback with rifles on their shoulder, riding through the woods and moving on a line that led them past me, at a distance of about 50 or 60 yards. Perceiving that these men were equipped as hunters, I remained almost breathless for the purpose of hearing their conversation. When they came so near, I could distinguish their voices. They were talking of the blessed place to stand for the purpose of seeing the deer, from which I inferred that they had sent men to some other point for the purpose of rousing the deer with dogs. After they had passed that point on their way that was nearest to me and were beginning to recede from me, one of them asked the other if he had heard that a Negro had run away the day before yesterday. in Morgan County, to which his companion answered in the negative. The first then said he had seen an advertisement at the store which offered $100 reward for the runaway whose name was Charles. And well, we know this is Charles. Charles is in the bush. The conversation of these horsemen were now interrupted by the cry of hounds at a distance in the woods, and heightened the speed of their horses. They were soon out of my sight and hearing. Information on the state of the country through which I was traveling was the highest value to me, and nothing could be more nearly interest me than a knowledge of the fact that my flight was known to white people. Sorry, who resided round about and before me. It was now necessary for me to become doubly vigilant and to concert with myself measures of the highest moment. The first resolution that I took was I would travel no more in the daytime. This was the season of hunting deer, and knowing that the hunters were under the necessity of being as silent as possible in the woods, I saw at a glance that they would be at least as likely to discover me in the forest before I could see them, as I should be to them before I might. Wait, what is he saying? He says, I saw at a glance that they would be at least as likely to discover me in the forest before I could see them, as I should be to see them before I myself could be seen. I was now very hungry, but exceedingly loath to make any further breaches on my bag of meal, except in extreme necessity. Feeling confident that there was a plantation within a few rods of me, I was anxious to have a view of it, and hoped that I might find a cornfield upon it, from which I could obtain a supply of roasting ears. Fearful to stand upright, I crept along through the low ground, where I then was, at time rising myself to my knees, for the purpose of obtaining a better view of things about me. In this way I advanced till I came in view of the high fence, and beyond this saw cotton, tall and flourishing, but no sign of corn. I crept up close to the fence, where I found the trunk of a large tree that had been felled in the clearing of the field. Standing upon this and looking over the plantation, I saw tassels of corn at the distance of half a mile, growing in a field which was bordered on one side by the wood in which I stood. It was now 9 or 10 in the morning, and I had slept but little the night before. I crept into the bushes, great numbers of which grew in and about the top of the falling tree, and hungry as I was, fell asleep. When I awoke, it appeared to me from the position of the sun, which I had carefully noted before I lay down, to be about 1 or 2 o'clock. At this, as this was the time of the day when the heat is most oppressive, and when everyone was most likely to be absent from the forest, I again moved, and taking a circuitous route at some distance from the field, reached the fence opposite the cornfield, without having met anything to alarm me. Having cautiously examined everything around me, as well by eye as by ear, and finding all quiet, I ventured to cross the fence and pluck from the standing stalks about a dozen good ears of corn, which I stole back in the thicket in the safety. This corn was of no use to me without fire to roast it, and it was equally dangerous to kindle fire by night as by day. The light at one time and the smoke at another might betray me to those who I knew were ever ready to pursue and arrest me. Hunger eats through stone walls, says the proverb, and an empty stomach is a petitioner whose solicitations cannot be refused, if there is anything to satisfy them with. Having regained the woods in safety, I ventured to go as far as the side of the swamp, which I knew to be at least at the distance of 200 or 300 yards by the appearance of the timber. When in the swamp, I felt pretty secure, but determined that I would never again attempt to travel in the neighborhood of a plantation in the daytime. When in the swamp a quarter of a mile, I collected some dry wood and lighted it with the aid of my timber box, flint and steel. This was the first fire that I kindled on my journey, and I was careful not to burn but dry wood to prevent the formation of smoke. Here I roasted my corn and ate as much as I could, After my dinner, I lay down and slept for 3 or 4 hours. When I awoke, the sun was scarcely visible through the treetops. It was evening, and prudence required me to leave the swamp before dark, lest I should not be able to find my way out. Approaching the edge of the swamp, I watched the going down of the sun and noted the stars as they appeared in the heavens. I had long since learned to distinguish the North Star from all the other luminaries of the night, and the seven pointers were familiar to me. These heavenly bodies were all the guides I had to direct me on my way. And as soon as the night had set in, I commenced my march through the woods, bearing as nearly due east as I could. I took this course for the purpose of getting down the country as far as the road leading from Augusta to Morgan County, with the intention of pursuing the route by which I had come out from South Carolina, deemed it more safe to travel the high road by night than to attempt to make my way at random over the country, guided only by the stars. I traveled all night, keeping the North Star on my left hand as nearly as I could, and passing many plantations, taking care to keep a great distance from the houses. I think I traveled at least 25 miles tonight without passing any road that appeared so wide or so much beaten as that which I had traveled when I came from South Carolina. This night I passed through a peach orchard laden with fine ripe fruit, which I filled my pockets and hat before day. In crossing a cornfield, I pulled a supply of roasting ears, with which and my peaches I retired at break of day to a large wood, into which I traveled more than a mile before I halted. Here, in the midst of a thicket of highly, whortleberry bushes, I encamped for the day. I made my breakfast upon roasted corn and peaches, and then lay down and slept unmolested until after 12 o'clock, when I woke and rose up for the purpose of taking a better view of my quarters. But I was scarcely on my feet when I was attacked by a swarm of hornets that issued from a large nest that hung on the limb of a tree within 20 or 30 feet from me. I knew that the best means of making peace with my hostile neighbors was to lie down with my face to the ground, and this attitude I quickly took, not however before I had been stung by several of my assailants, which kept humming woo, through the air about me for a long time, and prevented me from leaving this spot until after sundown. And after they had retired to rest from night, I now commenced the attack on my part, and taking a handful of dry leaves, approached the nest, which was full as large as a half bushel, and throwing the leaves into the hole at the bottom of the nest, through which its tenants passed in and out, secured the whole garrison, prisoners in their own citadel. I now cut off the branch upon which the nest hung and threw it with its contents into my evening fire, over which I roasted a supply of corn for my night's journey. Okay, he threw the hornets in the fire. For those who just joined us, we were reading 2 chapters today, so we're on chapter 15, and this one is a short chapter, so it will be done shortly. It's getting real interesting. He running away at this point. For the first time, we're hearing about his family. He's trying to get back to Maryland. He says, commencing my march this evening soon after nightfall, I traveled until about 1 o'clock in the morning, as nearly as I could estimate the time by the appearance of the stars, when I came upon a road which from its width and beaten appearance seemed to be the road to Morgan County. After traveling for a day or two near the road, I at last found myself at daybreak one morning in the sight of home of my late master's friend. Don't go there. Sorry, don't go there. Spoken of in our journey to Savannah. I was desperately hungry, and the idea swayed me to throw myself upon his generosity and beg for food. Don't go there. It seemed to me that, I'm sorry, this gentleman was too benevolent a man, don't go there, to arrest and send me back to my cool mistress. And yet, how could I expect or even hope that a cotton planter would see a runaway slave on his premises and not cause him to be taken up and sent home? I hope he doesn't go there. Failing to seize a runaway slave when he has seen him in his power is held to be one of the most dishonorable acts to which a Southern planter can subject himself. Nor should the people of the North be surprised at this. Slaves are regarded in the South as the most precious of all earthly possessions, and at the same time, as precarious and hazard kind of property, in the enjoyment of which the master is not safe. The planter may well be compared to the inhabitants of a national frontier, which is opposed to the inroads of hostile invading tribes, where all are in like danger and subject to the fears. It is expected that all will be governed by like sentiments and act upon like principles, meaning I can't trust that dude. I stood and looked at the house of this good planter for more than an hour, really, after the sun had risen, and saw all the moments which usually take place, movements which usually take place on a cotton plantation in the morning. Long before the sun was up, the overseer produced, sorry, I'm bugging out. The overseer proceeded to the field at the head of the hands. The black woman who attended to the cattle and milked the cows had gone to the cow pen with her pails, and the smoke ascended from the chimney of the kitchen before the doors at the great house were open, or any of the members of the family were seen abroad. At length, two young ladies opened the door and stood in the freshness of the morning air. These were soon joined by a brother, and at least I saw the gentleman himself leave the house and walk towards the stables that stood at some distance from the house on my left. I think even now that it was a foolish resolution that emboldened me to show myself to this gentleman. Let me read that again because he went there. Let me read that again. Let me read that again. I'm sorry. It says, I think even now that it was a foolish resolution that emboldened me to show myself to this gentleman. It was like throwing oneself in the way of a lion who is known sometimes to spare those who he might destroy. But I resolved to go and meet this planter, oh boy, he went, at his stables and tell him my whole story. Issuing from the woods, I crossed the field unperceived by the people at the house, and going directly to the stables, presented myself to the proprietor as he stood looking at a fine horse in one of the yards. At first, he did not know me and asked me whose man I was. I then asked him if he did not remember and named the time when I had been at his house. I then told him at once I was a runaway, that my master was dead, and my mistress was so cruel I could not live with her. Not omitting to show the scars on my back and to give a full account of the manner in which they had been made. The gentleman stood and looked at me more than a minute without uttering a word, and then said, I will not betray you, but you must not stay here. It must not be known that you were on this plantation and that I saw and conversed with you. However, as I suppose you are hungry, you may go to the kitchen and get your breakfast with my house servants. But that don't make sense. Why are you gonna make him go to the kitchen if he ain't supposed to be there? Sorry. And then set off for the house, and I followed, but turned into the kitchen as he ordered me. I was soon supplied with a good breakfast of cold meat, warm bread, as much new buttermilk as I could choose to drink. Before I sat down at breakfast, the lady of the house came into the kitchen with her two daughters and gave me a dram of peach brandy. I drank this brandy and was very thankful for it, but I am fully convinced now that it did much more harm than good, and that this part of kindness of this most excellent family was altogether misplaced. While I was taking my breakfast, a black man came into the kitchen and gave me $1, and he said his master had sent me, and the same time laying on the table before me a package of meat and bread weighing at least 10 pounds wrapped up in a cloth. On delivering these things, the black man told me that his master desired me to quit his premises as soon as I had finished my breakfast. This injunction I obeyed, and within less than half an hour, y'all know I'm getting a little bit tired. This is my last paragraph here. This injunction I obeyed, and within less than an hour after I entered this truly hospitable house, I quitted forever, but not without leaving behind my holiest blessing upon the heads of its inhabitants. It was yet early in the morning when I regained the woods on the opposite side of the plantation from that by which I had entered it. And that is the end of the reading of chapter 15. Thank you for sticking with me. And some of the little typos, the letters on this page is typed small. And but all praise be to the Most High. That was very interesting. I was saying don't go. He went. So I don't know. We're gonna have to wait and see. We have 5 more chapters. We're gonna double up to the end of the month. Um, If anybody has any question or comments, I think I heard a little comment going on. For anyone who's on the phone, if you have any question or comments, feel free to do so. We read 2 chapters, very eventful. The mic is open. Sometime. Okay, we see some comments here. Hold on one second as I try to pull them up. We have Iman Janita. Well, earlier on, she said, I can barely stand to hear this injustice affected upon them. Toda for your reading and bringing this to the people. Um, she says, I'm like the people in the movie theater who says, don't go there. Indeed. Yeah, Ima, if you heard earlier on, as he was going on that road trip to Savannah to get the groceries with his master, um, he stopped there. So for some reason, I just knew that he was going to try to do it again. And he deliberated amongst himself, but he ended up going anyway. We're not sure how it's going to play out, but, he did what he did. It's not like you could jump in the story and change it, but so it is. But so far, this is the first time that since he left them, and he reached to Carolina, South Carolina, that he mentioned, I find it strange. I'm not sure where to place Charles at this time, because whether it's a coping mechanism, like he didn't mention for the 4 years thereafter, the way he's telling the story, he doesn't mention his family. And so he says that he would commit to stay with his master, if the master was alive. But now that the master's dead is the only reason. This is the first time you hear him talk about running away, which I thought was just very, very interesting as we listen to how this story is unfolding. I hear my thing going ding, so I'm gonna look here. Okay, and his family, exactly. He was resolved to stay, and he had many opportunities, but he was comfortable, and he just liked eating meat. He was comfortable with his meat eating as long as he didn't get beaten. I really think it was the beating that made him say, you know what, I'm done. But I also thought it was interesting that when he got a taste of what it's like to beat on people, he started to step in that role a little bit to compel his own brothers by a whip. So that's also what we see in today's time. As soon as we get a little bit of power, we get a little bit buck wild. And it's, they say absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it goes beyond color lines, because we saw his story. But again, it's very interesting. Meet us tomorrow for the reading of chapter, what's that, 15? What chapter are we up to? 16 and 17? I'm a little bit tired this evening. Yes, but we're going to read 2 chapters tomorrow, so that we can finish up this book. So I want to thank everybody for joining us for this installment of the LEV Project. Um, Very, very interesting. If you want to get the book, because I know sometimes reading off the computer is a little bit difficult, the next book that's going to be coming up is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And this narrative is told from the feminine perspective. Her name is Harriet Jacobs. You can get the book for less than $4 on Amazon, and it's called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So definitely check that out if you want to be prepared for the next reading that we're going to start in the beginning of February. So once again, thank everybody for joining us, and I pray you have a blessed night. If you have any questions or if you have any sentiments that you would like to share, feel free to do so. If you need to journal these emotions out, because it surely does stir up some emotions within us. So if you need to journal these out, or to channel, to find a way to positively work through what we're feeling, because sometimes we don't want to read because it's just so painful. So we just say stop. But if we allow the emotions to run their course and get an understanding from what we're reading, then that's part of the healing process. And as anybody knows me, it's all about healing for me. So it's difficult to listen to, it's difficult to process, but once we get to the underside, then, we'll get understanding and we'll get healing. So praise be to the Most High. I pray everybody have a blessed evening. I'm about to go rest up my voice here. And I'm supposed to have an interview tomorrow. So if you see a little notification go out, I want to make sure the elder confirms. We're gonna talk a little bit about the abortion issue in the community. So I'm supposed to have um one of the leading activist in the community who often talks about that and knows a lot about it. So I just want to confirm for tomorrow before I put it all the way out there. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And until next time, everybody have a blessed evening.